The previous two videos recounted the events of the July days and how the Bolsheviks changed their tactics to try and guide the rather impatient workers and soldiers of Petrograd away from an all-out confrontation that at that stage could have ended in disaster for the revolution. However, the July days still didn't come without a cost. Yes, in lives and injuries, but critically, for understanding the ebb and flow of the revolutionary events of 1917, politically too. So before explaining what happened next, it's worth drawing up a balance sheet for the July days. Because a sharp struggle had clearly taken place in Petrograd. Lenin later described it like this: an anti-government demonstration. That would be the most formally accurate description of events. But the point is that this was no ordinary demonstration. It was something considerably more than a demonstration, yet less than a revolution. Importantly, these events were not repeated in most of the country. In a few towns, some large demonstrations took place, but in others, even Moscow, the response to calls to come out onto the streets was far more limited in both numbers and enthusiasm. Trotsky explains that the principal cause of this weak and unfavourable reaction of the country lay in the fact that the provinces, having received the February Revolution from the hands of Petrograd without a struggle, were far slower than the capital in digesting new facts and ideas. An additional period was necessary before the vanguard could draw up to its own position the heavy reserves. In fact, it was only a few days later, on July the 7th, that the reports that could have so easily undermined the compromises started to reach Petrograd. This was news of the catastrophic failure of the offensive and the fact that German troops had broken through on the southwestern front. However, now, far from strengthening the Bolsheviks, the defeat of the July days meant now, as Trotsky puts it, that the wave of indignation and despair rolling back from the front fell in with the wave of shattered hopes radiating from Petrograd. The lesson received by the masses in the capital was too severe for anyone to think of an immediate renewal of the struggle. Moreover, the bitter feelings caused by the meaningless defeat sought expression, and the patriots succeeded to a certain extent in directing it against the Bolsheviks. Trotsky goes on to make a comparison to events in France in July 1791 and June 1848, and in Germany in January 19, as well as the Paris Commune of 1871. Read the chapter to get the full detail. But he says, a prototype of the July days is to be found in all the old revolutions, with various, but generally speaking unfavourable and frequently catastrophic results. The stages involved in the inner mechanics of a bourgeois revolution, inasmuch as the class that sacrificed most for the success of the revolution and hopes the most from it receives the least of all. The possessing class, which is brought to power by the revolution, is inclined to think that with this revolution it has accomplished its mission, and is therefore most of all concerned to demonstrate its reliability to the forces of reaction. The disappointment of the masses follows very quickly. It follows even before their vanguard has cooled off after the revolutionary struggle. The people imagine that with a new blow they can carry through or correct that which they did not accomplish decisively enough before. Hence the impulse to a new revolution, a revolution without preparation, without program, without estimation of the reserves, without calculation of consequences. So the July defeat ended in defeat for the masses and ushered in a period of reaction where the counter-revolution tried to beat back the revolution. However, they were unable to succeed, and the masses did regroup culminating, as we know, in the October Revolution. Now, this owed a great deal to the correct policy of the Bolsheviks in managing to pull back the workers and soldiers from launching prematurely a full-scale conflict in July. Here was a clear lesson on the need for a careful analysis of the balance of forces, of the need to learn from the experiences of the past, to discuss tactics, to plan and organise. In short, for the need for a revolutionary party. Workers too now also had a much clearer idea as to why they should heed the advice of the Bolsheviks. Trotsky says that thanks to the party's taking its place boldly at the head of the movement, it was able to stop the masses at the moment when the demonstration began to turn into a test of armed strength. The blow struck at the masses and the party in July was very considerable, but it was not a decisive blow. The victims were counted by tens, not by tens of thousands. The working class fully preserved its fighting cadres, and these cadres had learned much. So the experience of the July days had made clear that there was no question of persuading the compromisers to peacefully stand aside. Again, Trotsky sums it up. In July, the Petrograd workers, although able to seize the power if they'd wanted to, nevertheless offered it to the Executive Committee. Many still cherished the illusion that everything could be obtained by words and demonstrations, that by frightening the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, you could get them to carry out a common policy with the Bolsheviks. Even the advanced sections of the class had no clear idea by which roads it was possible to arrive at the power. Lenin wrote soon after, "The real mistake of our party on the 3rd and 4th of July, as events now reveal, was only this, that the party still considered possible a peaceful development of the political transformation by way of a change of policy on the part of the Soviets. In reality, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries had already tangled and bound themselves up by compromising with the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie had become so counter-revolutionary that there was no longer any use talking about a peaceful development." But before making use of these July lessons, the party had to go through some heavy weeks, during which it seemed to the short-sighted enemy that the power of Bolshevism was conclusively broken. Now, it had been on the night of July the 4th that the rumours had first started circulating around the Tauride Palace that there was proof that Lenin was a German agent. And the next day, a small right-wing newspaper first reported the documents purporting to reveal that Lenin was receiving directions and money from the German government. But by July the 6th, the whole press was full of the news. Of course, Lenin was the leader of a revolutionary party who had lived for decades in a struggle against the ruling class of every country, not least German militarism. To those that knew anything about Lenin, the idea that he could be in the pay of a foreign power was simply ridiculous. But for the masses who had only begun to hear of Bolshevism in the last few months, it was easier to believe. The idea of financial backing was particularly absurd, given the Bolsheviks' constant shortage of cash. In the war years up to the February Revolution, the Bolsheviks had only been able to distribute a total of 300,000 leaflets in Petrograd, owing to lack of finance. After February, the swift growth in both membership and workers' donations to the party had helped considerably. Nevertheless, Pravda was still the smallest of the party papers. Trotsky explains that in spite of the Spartan regime of economy instituted by Lenin, the party was always in need. In order to send papers to the front, it became necessary again and again to take up special collections amongst the workers. And even so, the Bolshevik papers arrived in the trenches in incomparably fewer numbers than the papers of the compromisers and the liberals. In April, a city conference of the party appealed to the workers of Petrograd to collect the 75,000 rubles lacking for the purchase of a printing plant. The sum was more than covered, and the party finally acquired its own press. But that was the same one which the Junkers shattered to the ground in July. Of course, the slanderers were always able to point to Lenin's journey through Germany as proof of his friendship with the German government. But as Trotsky pointed out, an agent would have travelled through the hostile territory concealed and without the slightest danger. Only a revolutionist, confident of himself to the last degree, would have dared openly to transgress the laws of patriotism in wartime. I mean, that's not to say that the German military staff hadn't calculated that perhaps Lenin's return might help weaken the resolve of the Russian army. But the October and subsequent German revolutions proved that they miscalculated in working out what the final result was going to be. Trotsky points out, of the two strategists, Ludendorff, who permitted Lenin to go, and Lenin, who accepted his permission, Lenin saw farther and better. Now, the revelations had first been passed from officials of the intelligence service to the War Minister Kerensky right back on May the 16th. This notoriously reactionary organisation had never been slow to take on whatever dirty business was required of them. But the accusations were so fantastic that ministers put them to one side for a month and a half. However, the Attorney General described how, on July the 4th, when it became clear that the provisional government in Petrograd was wholly without reliable armed forces, it was decided in the district headquarters to try to create a psychological change in the regiments by means of some strong medicine. The substance of the documents was communicated to representatives of the Preobrazhensky regiment nearest to headquarters. Those present observed what an overwhelming impression the communication made. From that moment it was clear what a powerful weapon was in the hands of the government. And so the counter-revolution had taken no time in making good use of its new weapon. Prince Lvov was quite clear which war he was really interested in winning, saying, "Our deep breach on the Lenin front has incomparably more importance for Russia, in my firm opinion, than the breach made by the Germans on the southwestern front." You couldn't put it clearer than that. Now, Kerensky must have known that the accusations were preposterous, but now pronounced them as extraordinarily serious. Even if the Menshevik leaders didn't openly back the slanders, they certainly did nothing to stop the attacks either. And as early as July the 5th, Lenin could see that given the chance, this accelerating campaign of filth and lies might not stop until the Bolshevik leaders were silenced for good, by imprisonment or even death. So he and his Zinoviev went into hiding in a worker's home just in time. Kerensky had returned from the front on the 6th, fresh with the reactionary ideas of the generals in his ears. His demand for decisive action against the Bolsheviks quickly led to the government resolving to bring to trial all the leaders of the so-called armed insurrection and also to disband the regiments that had taken part in the mutiny. Lenin and Zinoviev made arrangements so that the inquiry commission set up by the Soviet EC could meet them at a safe address, but no commissioners came to meet them. The officers and Junkers, Trotsky says, were now beating up and arresting in the streets everyone who protested against the charge of espionage against the Bolsheviks. Lenin therefore finally decided to go into hiding, not from the investigation, but from possible attempts upon his life. And the two leaders spent a few weeks hiding in a forest outside the capital, sleeping in a haystack. Lenin then left to a safe house in Finland. He returned secretly to Petrograd in September, only reappearing in public for the first time on the day of the October insurrection. Of course, while doing nothing to protect Lenin, the EC took every opportunity to condemn him for supposedly refusing to take part in the investigation. The left of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, even some Bolsheviks, also questioned why Lenin had chosen to leave Petrograd. But Lenin could see only too well what justice in the hands of the reaction would look like in the atmosphere following the July days. As Trotsky points out in his history, the murders of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in January 1919, at an equivalent stage of the German Revolution, shows what may have befallen Lenin if he had not fled. On the 21st of July, an indictment on a charge of state treason was published against Lenin, Zinoviev and others, including Kollontai. It accused the Bolshevik leaders of working with the aid of foreign governments to encourage the Russian troops to refuse to fight, as well as organising an armed insurrection in Petrograd from the 3rd to 5th of July. The same charges were used to indict Trotsky and Lunacharsky when they were arrested and imprisoned on July the 23rd. This was a show of strength from the newly formed government of Kerensky, a development which I'll describe in the next video. Now, to make the charges stick, Trotsky was even accused of having travelled through Germany to Russia, even though his route from New York via Stockholm was common enough knowledge. So those accusations would normally have been too obviously unbelievable to use. But in the embittered atmosphere following war, defeat, ruin and revolution, the ruling classes needed a scapegoat. The accusation of links with Germany had long been used by them to undermine enemies of all shades. Trotsky ends his chapter, called The Month of the Great Slander, with an analysis that's worth reading in full. But let me just quote a few parts from it. It's definitely worth reading. The July slander against the Bolsheviks was the natural fruit of panic and hate. Was it in actual fact possible for the possessing classes to surrender their place to the Bolsheviks without having made a last desperate effort to trample them in the blood and filth? That tangle of slander was inevitably fated to come down on the heads of the Bolsheviks. The revelations of the retired ensign from the intelligence service were only a materialization of the ravings of possessing classes who found themselves in a blind alley. For that reason, the slander acquired such a fateful force. The history of all revolutions and civil wars invariably testifies that a threatened or overthrown ruling class is disposed to find the cause of its misfortunes not in itself, but in foreign agents and emissaries. Under these theories, there lies an indirect historical foundation. Consciously or unconsciously, every nation, at the critical period of its existence, makes especially broad and bold borrowings from the treasury of other peoples. The new ideas and institutions thus appear to the conservative strata, first of all as alien, as foreign inventions. The village against the city, the backwoods against the capital, the petty bourgeois against the worker. They all defend themselves under the guise of a national force, resisting foreign influence. When it comes to a threat against their material interests, the educated classes set in motion all the prejudices and confusion which humanity is dragging in its wagon train behind it. The slander of those years of war and revolution was striking. However, it does contain a variation. From the piling up of quantity, we get a new quality. The struggle of the other parties amongst themselves was almost like a family spat in comparison with their common baiting of the Bolsheviks. In the assault on the Bolsheviks, all the ruling forces, the government, the courts, the intelligence service, the staffs, the officialdom, the municipalities, the parties of the Soviet majority, their press, their orators, all constituted one colossal unit. The slanders poured down like Niagara. Without exaggeration, July 1917 was the month of the most gigantic slander in world history.